the this edition of the office hours for the VMware customer success team for VMware Cloud on AWS. This is the, like I say, the EMEA variant. Joining me today online, we have Prasanna G, my compatriot from the customer success team. So if you'd just like to say a good morning for us, Prasanna.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Will.
No worries. So this morning, we're hoping to have another colleague, Aidan Dalgleish, who some of you may know, join us as well. And if we're lucky, we'll get Rick Hoffmann joining us as well, like we normally do. So not a huge amount of planned stuff to talk about today, but I did want to go into a number of things that I've come across over the last week since we last talked. And one of those was around, I guess, some of the differences that you'll notice between on-prem and VMware Cloud on AWS, and the different way you might need to do things, driven again by change in your permissions that you have within VMC. So, first of all, what I will do is a quick reminder to double check the roadmap if you're looking for a specific feature set, and that can be found at cloud.vmware.com/vmc-aws/roadmap. And in here we also have use cases, pricing information, everything else as well. It's always good to check back. Also, always good to check on the release notes. I do bring this up every week, but always good to check. As you see, there was something that came out just last week. So a new feature was dropped, and that was the DR protection of on-premises NSXT based data centers. So yeah, that one actually passed me by. So I should sort of follow my own guidance really, and always check back here on a weekly basis. But yeah, so what I'd like to do is just dive into one of the things I've been working with a customer on this week, as I said before, and that was around anti-affinity rules. Now, as you know, on premises, how you configure anti-affinity rules, you could set them at the cluster level, and you set it so that VMs can either reside on or keep apart from each other on hosts. Now, as you'll know from earlier sessions and from your own experiences with VMware Cloud on AWS, your permissions or your rights within the platform are, let's say, not necessarily limited, but restricted, shall we say, in order to ensure that we maintain our manageability of the platform. So certain tasks that you can perform on premises at the host level, we disable so that you can't accidentally remove a host or change something to a host that impacts our ability to manage the platform. So there are different ways of managing some objects within VMware Cloud on AWS. And I thought what I'd do is I'd first take you through the GUI, the way to manage it in the vSphere client, as you see here, and just briefly, for those new to the platform, the way you get to your vSphere client is you click on your VMware Cloud on AWS object in the Cloud Services portal. This brings you to your software-defined data centers browser view. We click on the data center, the SDDC that we want to look at, and then from within here you can launch your vCenter, which obviously I've already done. And I'm within my vCenter here. So what I actually need to do is there's a couple of tasks I need to do to prepare for this. So what I need to actually do is go into the menu and go down to tags and custom attributes. And like I was saying, that the reason for this is the change in permissions. Now I cannot go into my host and clusters view and manage stuff up at the cluster level like you would do on your on-prem because of these restricted rights. So what I have to be able to do is another mechanism for applying something that I want to apply to VMs, regardless of where they sit, that applies kind of at a cluster level. So the way we can do this is we can create tags and custom attributes. And what I've done is I've come in here this morning and I've created an anti-affinity tag, and I've also created a category. So two prerequisites, so tags and categories. So if we look at my oops, we'll just go back one. we look at my anti-affinity category that I created. Very simple. I gave it a name. I apply it to my virtual machines, so we can obviously apply different categories and tags to different areas within your inventory. So at this stage, we can apply to certain things at cluster level or data store level, but right now I'm just going to apply it at the virtual machine level. In fact, what I might do is just tag it for cluster as well, just so you can see the change that's there. So I've got my anti-affinity category. I'm going to create an anti-affinity tag as well, which is very simple. I just give it a name and align it to my category. And then what we need to do is just leg it back into our virtual machine. And if we look at our virtual machine sort of summary pane, we can see there's a section for tags here. And I can assign a tag, pick the tag I want, which is my anti-affinity tag, and assign it. Now, anti-affinity on one VM is a moot point. So what I'll do is I'll pick another VM and I will assign the same tag. Now I've set this to be obviously keep apart, and then so that's now set. So what we now need to do is just give it some time for DRS to kick in and move those VMs around, and we'll be able to check because we can see the IP of the host that these VMs are sitting on. Relatively straightforward. But the reason I wanted to highlight this is probably more of an impact to people with massive environments, lots and lots of hosts that have a lot of anti-affinity requirements, and potentially those guys that want to do this at the API layer, right? So perhaps maybe this would be a good intro to bring you into the conversation, Prasanna, and get you to maybe discuss from an API standpoint how you would do this, because obviously there's a change there as well. It's no longer the same command. So
Yeah. So when we talk about APIs, we have maybe 3 layers or 2 layers we frequently use with respect to VMware Cloud on AWS. So we start with the CSP or Cloud Service Portal, which is like a starting point of the APIs whenever we interact with the VMware Cloud Services. So if you can click on the account in the top right,
up in here,
and no, under your name,
yeah, there we go.
and my account and API token. So to start interacting with all the options that are available via APIs in the VMware Cloud Services. So this is one of the first step we'll have to do. We will have to generate a new token and use that token to get authorized in your subsequent API calls. So that is the first step to do. And yeah, so we can also pick the roles and specific services this token is active for. Yeah, let's click on generate.
Right, there we go. So we've generated my token. I've downloaded it and I've copied it to my my machine as well. So we can continue from there.
Yeah, so we can use this token for our subsequent calls. So we could use multiple methods to make API calls. We could either go for client-based, where we can install Postman or do a direct curl calls from our scripts, or to quickly get started and see like how the APIs look like within the portal. We could go back to the VMC portal. Now remember, we are currently in the context of console.cloud.vmware.com. If you look at the URL in the top, so this is where we start with the CSP authorization, or where we take care of the authorization for our API calls, meaning we generate our API token here. But once we do that and once we have our token, so we are good to go with the subsequent calls. So now let's get into the VMware Cloud on AWS. And once we get there, we can see that the context changes to vmc.vmware.com, and we can go to the developer center in the top. just to quickly see like what are the APIs that are available, and under API Explorer, we can see two sections. The APIs available for the VMware Cloud on AWS specifically, or for the other cloud services right below that. So if we select the VMC and maybe do a test run for one of the APIs.
Any particular one you'd like to select by any chance?
Yeah, we could just pick one of the first one, the account connection operations, and do a small get.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and so one of the cool feature that is available in the portal is the org ID is automatically picked from the left-hand side, and we can also populate the SDDC ID in the left-hand pane or in the left-hand drop-down, so that that is picked up automatically in the API calls, so that we don't have to input that every time in our calls.
Yeah, that's good. They're not the
feature.
easiest things to remember, are they?
Yeah.
So we'll just wait for that to connect, yeah, and filter the results.
I think
Oh, Aidan, welcome. Sorry, your microphone just went a bit funny there.
Sorry about that. Yeah, what I was going to kind of call out, there's obviously a sort of a warning there on the screen around those API calls with the Explorer. That can be a great way of testing APIs, as Prasanna's going to talk you through. But bear in mind, they are running against your SDDC. If you can do some testing, perhaps don't test.
That's a very good point. Yes. So maybe if you had a test SDDC, or you had a one node that you deployed just to try some stuff against.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Some of the get methods, I think. So I'm sorry, Prasanna.
Yeah, that's a very good point actually. Because just to give an example, when we delete an SDDC from UI, it asks for like 5 checkboxes for you to select before you can even delete the SDDC, just as a protection mechanism. But in API, you can just delete the SDDC accidentally. So we have to be very careful before invoking the calls.
It's a little bit sleepy this morning. So are there any other mechanisms? So you mentioned Postman, so you can run Postman from your client. Are there any other common ways to interact with the APIs that you've come across?
Yeah. So maybe I can quickly show my desktop.
Absolutely.
If that's okay.
Yeah. So if I stop my share and you share yours. Yeah. And then if you share, and I'll drag that over. All right.
Let me know once you are able to see my screen.
Yeah, we can see that now.
Okay. So you can see that I have a folder within my Postman app in my desktop, and there are some pre-populated API calls. Now, these API calls are readily available for download from code.vmware.com. We can just do a quick search, or we can also download these samples from within the developer center. And I think we can have a look once Will shares the screen back. So all we have to do is just authorize using the token we have, or we obtain from the first step we just showed. So we just have to make the authorization call. And once we have this, we can make our subsequent calls to get, maybe let's list some orgs that I'm part of, or maybe let me list the SDDCs to which I have access to. So we can see that this specific get call is listing all the SDDCs that are part of this org, and it also provides like many other details with respect to the SDDC. So yeah, so this is just a quick example to show like how to access using the API. But of course, we may have to access these APIs through other methods like curl, so that we can automate or script it. So let me quickly share my command line. And
Okay, we can see that again.
so I already entered the variables, and let me quickly do the same call, which I did here via the Postman, so that so the first step is basically to authorize. So let me run that real quick. So you can see that I'm basically doing a curl call to this URL. So this specific API call is already pre-populated in the Postman, but I'm specifically mentioning that in my curl call here. So, and I'm specifying some of the headers that are also pre-populated in Postman. So, so that's it. Once I authorize, I can do subsequent calls. Maybe I can do a quick call to list all my networks that are available, or network segments that are available within my SDDC.
Yeah, and
you can see that, yeah. So I have multiple segments. So just a quick example to pull the list of segments I have in a specific SDDC.
Cool. And with relation to for example, finding out where you can get these API calls from. So we briefly looked at the API Explorer. So let's just move that out of the way. So we looked at still a spinning wheel there, but so we can look at code examples, for example. So here we have code that's been submitted by community or by VMware employees like Brian Graff and Alan Renouf. And we can download these code samples to run, correct? Are there any other places we can go to browse the API that you're aware of?
Yeah, so there is a small distinction when it comes to the NSXT-based APIs. So let me quickly share my screen again through Zoom.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry for the back and forth.
I think while Prasanna's just getting his screen ready as well, as obviously Prasanna showed you an example of using curl to interact with the APIs. There's obviously numerous different ways you can do that. For example, I'm a big fan of PowerShell and PowerCLI. So you can that same net result using the invoke REST method commandlet from PowerShell, and then you can the same parameters that Prasanna was using through Postman and through curl.
Yeah, good point. So basically, any way you're currently used to interacting with the vSphere client, the actions you actually perform might change slightly based on the slightly restricted permissions we were mentioning earlier. But your preferred method, for example, for you was PowerCLI. You can continue to work in PowerCLI with VMware Cloud on AWS. It's not you don't have to learn a new language or new interface. It's the same as it is effectively.
Yeah, essentially what you have is obviously with so taking PowerShell and PowerCLI as an example, PowerCLI with a set of pre-built commandlets, which can make life a lot easier to work with APIs for those, especially for those who I guess are not as experienced with working with APIs. But then where those pre-built commandlets do not exist to consume and use the native REST APIs, there is a PowerShell commandlet of invoke REST method. So you can then just invoke standard REST methods against the API in the case where there isn't a specific made VMware commandlet as such.
Sure. Okay, so Prasanna has shared his screen out again. So what we'll do is we'll bring that up.
Yeah,
again.
that's a good point actually, because many customers might already have or running PowerCLI based scripts for their day-to-day activities, so they can just add a module for VMC or even tweak the existing scripts. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're really adventurous with something like PowerCLI, you can create your own custom functions that look and behave very much like a commandlet and could contain then the use of the REST methods. So So somebody who is perhaps more experienced could write that, and then other members of the team who are perhaps not as good with APIs could just consume a pre-built function written by somebody else.
Yeah. So coming back to the APIs, so the API calls we made so far were to the context of vmc.vmware.com, but as many of us are aware, the SDDCs come in two flavors in VMware Cloud on AWS. So all the new SDDCs are using NSXT as a backend. So previously, when we started, all the SDDCs came up with NSXV based architecture. So now we are moving to NSXT based, and obviously the APIs are a little different when it comes to NSXT. And yeah, a quick call out there. So any networking based API calls from the developer center may not work right now. So we are working on that, but a quick call out there. So why is that happening? So what is the difference between the NSXV based and NSXT based? So this networking and security tab here. So this is basically interacting with an NSXT policy API through a NSXT reverse proxy. And I will shortly show that what the URL looks like for this. But all the API calls for networking operations should be made to that NSXT reverse proxy. Let me quickly show. So we can actually pull that NSXT policy API URL and use that in our subsequent calls, like I did in my get network segments API call through APIs as well. But just for visualization purposes, let me quickly open the developer center in the Chrome and show how the UI responds, or what are the calls the UI are making, and which are the URLs we are hitting. So let me, where's the developer center? Here. So once I click on the networking and security tab, I can show the specific URL it talks with, and to get some idea. Yeah, let me stop here. Do you see the small pop-up, Will?
Yes,
where
absolutely.
it shows the
Yep. So you see the reverse proxy in the URL title.
Exactly. So that is the API URL, or the entire URL to which we usually make the calls for, and the format is going to be pretty similar even in the scripts. So we just have to modify the specific NSX edge we are making the call to in some cases, and things like that. So what I mean by that is we also have an NSXT policy manager documentation. So it is quite exhaustive. You can see the scroll bar size here.
Yeah, just a few pages there.
Yeah, so it's quite exhaustive. So just to make things easier, or let me quickly show an example here. So if I go to the L3 VPN section, you can see that there is a small variable-like component. So users and even the provider ID here. So these are like, we have to input specific values here to get the API to work. So to make things easier, you can probably refer to these URLs here just to get some idea like which variable we have to use in those specific API calls. You can see here that the tier-0s is the variable used here for the L3 VPNs. So just a quick way to show like how the URL looks like.
Yeah, that's a
also
really useful tip. Thanks.
Yeah, also to show the APIs that are available for the NSXT based calls.
Cool. So there are a number of places actually you can go to find the APIs available. I've come across a few in my sort of time working with them. If I can just grab the screen briefly, what I'm going to show is a couple of links. So what we have, just remember to share my screen out again. Here we go. So what we have is this page here. So console.cloud.vmware.com, CSP Gateway API docs, and there are a number of API breakdowns available for you to see. And then you can view these in Swagger. So a really sort of useful place to look, so you can get org information, subscription information, task, SDDC, ESX host information. So yeah, quite a bit of information available in there, and also via the Cloud Console that we were looking at before. We briefly touched on the Developer Center and the API Explorer and visibility there. Now, is there anywhere else that you can think of that we can get this information from? I know I've seen a few places in the past. We were looking at one yesterday, actually, Aidan, weren't we? Where we were looking for some of the API calls to do the policy stuff we were looking at.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think so. So the API references you're sort of looking at here, as Prasanna was sort of talking about earlier, about those various layers of where you can interact with the APIs. These are focused more around the CSP.
Yeah.
Now, another layer that we can look at is interacting with APIs directly with the vCenter server itself. So we were looking at some of the compute policy APIs for doing sort of VM anti-affinity rules, as you were showing earlier, Will.
Yeah, good point. Let's just let's just take that off the end of there, and then
and just sort of while you're getting that ready. Oh yeah, that's brilliant. You can show that there.
So now we can have a look at the API Explorer for that vCenter server. Wow, I'm clearly asking my machine to do too much this morning. There's one thing that we did while this just loads up. There's one thing that has caught me out a couple of times, and we both stumbled on yesterday. We were trying to run a cluster operation and we totally forgot to log in. so a really simple one there. So we were using our cloud admin at vmc.local account. Yep, and your password is available for visibility in here. Oops, in my SDDC that's linked to that vCenter, and I can look at that in my default user account. I can copy my password, nip back into here.
So the previous API calls we were making, so we were basically using the refresh token to do the authorization. So here we are basically interacting directly with the vCenter.
Absolutely, yeah.
We are using the cloud admin credentials. Okay.
Yeah, and then so these are some examples of some of the compute policies that Will mentioned we were doing some testing on yesterday, and then also obviously you still have the access to the standard vSphere APIs that you would be familiar with an on-premises environment. Just a key caveat to take on board there is that would be within the constraints of the permissions you have in a VMware Cloud on AWS SDDC.
Good point.
So the classic example here being you don't have the permission to interact with the cluster with the cloud admin account, and this is why one of the reasons why we now have the kind of compute policies API available here that can be consumed. Another thing to bear in mind actually is worth thinking about with the compute policies is it's not just about working around a permissions model. Actually, some of the logic I think behind that compute policies is the concept of, if you think about DRS rules and VM affinity, anti-affinity rules today, they're confined to a cluster, which is not very kind of cloud-like. What if you wanted to move, say, those two VMs to another cluster? Those DRS rules wouldn't be there. You'd have to recreate them. Whereas if you uplift the policy up to the vCenter level, as is the case here, that can then potentially be portable across clusters, or maybe in the future across on-prem, cloud, multiple environments. So that's something else to think about for some of the reasoning behind some of these changes.
No, that's a very good point, and that would then lead on to the I'd hate to say assumption, but a potential path that the products will take in the future is that this will then naturally flow into the on-prem versions. Therefore, the on-prem and the cloud versions are the same. So potentially the way you do things now on-prem might change to match the cloud version, so there's no difference. And then it's a seamless transition from one to the other, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. So
Also the compute policies might grow beyond our control, so it is imperative to move it to the policy-based structure and handle it more effectively instead of logging into the cluster-based settings every time to manage maybe like hundreds of settings.
absolutely,
So in
yeah.
a way, it is more convenient, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and we see, I mean, that's a trend we've seen across multiple products, right? We see the policy-based management for vSAN for the storage. We see the Policy Explorer for the networking, for the NSX interface, and we also now see a policy kind of interface for the management of the vSphere objects themselves. So it's clearly a direction we've decided to take, and we'll hopefully see grow and spread across all the product sets to make it consistent. So very brief dive into APIs there this morning. We do have a couple of viewers out there in Twitch land. So just a quick reminder, if you do have any questions and you're watching us right now, please drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box if you're on Zoom, and we will do our best to answer them or at least have a chat about them. I know I don't know if there's anything else relating to sort of the APIs that we want to talk about, or we can talk about anything else really. If any of you guys have got anything you'd like to talk about, it's also up on the table.
While you have the screen shared, if you can go back to the VMC portal, I'll quickly show where to download the Postman API samples.
Cool. Yeah.
Under the Developer Center.
Yep.
I think it should be available under the downloads.
Oh yeah.
Or code samples. Yeah, let's go back to the code samples and scroll down. It should be somewhere at the bottom, I think. Yeah, Postman REST samples. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. So we just
so all we have to do is just download and import into our Postman client and get started.
Brilliant. Or if Java's your thing, or Power CLI, there's a lot of stuff being posted on there. And I guess this will only grow as well as functionality grows, as more and more people writing their own. These can be published. These you mentioned the VMware code site earlier, so code.vmware.com. We have samples on here as well, actually for lots of our platforms, lots of our technology, and we can have a look here. So VROPS, VRO, dispatch, pivotal container services. So everything that you want to find, you can find in here. And so yeah, do check out VMware Code. It's another useful site to take stuff from. Yeah, what's often useful in here, what myself and Aidan were doing the other day, we were trawling through to find the exact commands required and the API calls required to translate something from an on-prem function to VMware Cloud on AWS. So yeah, it's definitely should be one of your saved tabs. Anything else, Prasanna or Aidan, that we want to sort of talk about in terms of API?
Yeah, I'm good for now, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think I have a huge amount to add. I could potentially quickly show some of that code we are doing sort of yesterday as his one I made earlier. I've still sort of got on the screen, if that would be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'll do is I'll just stop sharing my screen, let you share yours, and then we'll drag it across and just show people how easy it is to set up. I guess maybe an anti-affinity rule via the Power CLI, but we created one very briefly at the very beginning of the session today, or at least I dove into it. So let me full screen you, and then there we go. So might be a little bit small for some people, but hopefully you can make that out. Maybe if you make your font size a little bit larger, there we go. Cool.
Okay, so essentially, as sort of what Will was describing earlier, what we can sort of talk through if I find a couple of some of the examples. If I scroll up a little bit through some of my sort of prior code, you'll have to excuse some of the errors where I was made a few typos. So as Will sort of talked through earlier, around kind of creation of tags and the tag categories, there are existing Power CLI commandlets available to create a tag category and to create a new tag. So that's pretty simple and pretty easy to achieve. If you're not sure kind of on the various parameters of those, you can either sort of go to code.vmware.com and find the commandlet reference for Power CLI, or you can obviously use that. There's a get help commandlet, if I recall correctly, and you can sort of search and look for the commandlets available. So pretty simple to create a new tag category where you essentially provide it a name, the entity type for that category, whether that be virtual machines, whether that be hosts, an optional description, and the cardinality in terms of whether it's multiple or single entities can be associated with that tag category. The creation of a new tag is very much the same in terms of a name and a description. And what you do is that you associate the tag with the tag category. So here you can see I've created two different tags and I'm associating it with the same category. Now, sort of coming on to sort of what Prasanna was doing with the postman, you would see he had his various headers defined. So what I've done here is, I've essentially created a headers variable, and I've assigned the sort of prerequisite headers required to do a REST API call against the vCenter API. We'll scroll down a bit later on some of that. Yep, that's another example of running a tag. And then here, what I'm doing, I'm just essentially grabbing the ID of the tag you can see here and assigning that to a variable, because what I'm sort of doing now, I'm building the body of a REST command, a REST API call here, to define the spec to create a new compute policy with an anti-affinity rule. So that sort of tag ID, I was using that because I need that as a parameter here. So if you then sort of scroll down a bit further, this was me looking at various objects. And what we do later, I was talking earlier about the invoke REST method. And this is a standard PowerShell commandlet as opposed to a Power CLI commandlet where we can invoke a standard REST method. So you can see here, I defined those headers previously. I'm using the post method. This is the URI of the vCenter server in question, the same one you saw Will showing you earlier. And I've then supplied that body variable, which has the spec to create that new compute policy. And then I get returned essentially the ID of that policy when it's done. And then the last step that I'm doing, again, I think you saw Will do that from the GUI earlier, was essentially to then add the tags to those VMs. So I grabbed a couple of VMs that I've been working on, and then essentially assigned the tags to those virtual machines, and so therefore kind of completed the setup process. So probably a little bit of a sort of a whirlwind tour, but actually anybody who's sort of relatively familiar with Power CLI and PowerShell would probably be able to pick that up and automate the creation of those policies based on essentially the same process you saw Will do manually earlier on in the session. So hopefully that's useful. But if there's, I think as Will said earlier, if there's any kind of questions, happy to discuss them or try and answer them as best we can.
Yeah, and if you're picking this up on YouTube later on, you're obviously not live watching it now. You can always drop us a quick email at cloudcs@vmware.com, or tweet us at VMwareCloud AWS, or any of the individual tweets you see at the bottom of the screen there as well, and we'll get back to you. And if you've got any other topics you'd like us to discuss, please feel free to reach out in the same manner as well. Aidan, if you could just drop your screen share for a second.
Of course.
Right, so what we will then do is I'll just get rid of that. We'll go back in here and I'll just show very briefly those tags and custom attributes that you set up yesterday. So there was the web server, the tag that you set up, and then the category that you'd also set up. was this one. And then if you look at your VMs that you were playing with, you had you'd assigned your web server's policy, effectively your tag against the VM itself. So the your description visible there. So always a good idea to. I'm a big believer actually in descriptions for things. Obviously, as environments grow larger and larger, and you're playing around, even in a test and dev environment, if you're firing off and creating lots of custom properties or tags or anything like that, having a description there is useful because you individually will forget if you're doing a lot of this, but also for your colleagues. And to highlight that point, you'll notice that the one I created earlier, I didn't put a description in. So when I come back to this later, I may forget why I'd created this. And I'll give myself a little slap on the wrist for that, but I am going to delete it after this call, so we're good to go. But any of my colleagues that come in here may not know what that was for. They can clearly see it's Will's test, but who knows what Will's test is actually meaning for, what it was used for, when it's required for. So yeah, always add a description in there so that your colleagues don't end up getting lost in your test work. So yeah, anything else we'd like to have a quick chat about this morning? We've got a little bit of time left. If not, we did touch briefly on backups yesterday, but what I thought we might do is request maybe the public to ask us some point questions on backups. Maybe some we can, in a future session, we can go into some examples or cover off some of the best practices around backups from VMC, anything like that. But I've not really been diving too deep into anything else this past week that we can be a good thing to talk about. Really, I don't know if you guys have.
No, I don't think so. Certainly not on those topic areas this week. More of my focus this week has been looking at some of the sort of the API stuff. Some customer questions we've had recently.
Okay, well, if we've got no questions coming in from the field, and we've kind of run dry on stuff to show you today, what I will do is I'll end this call slightly early, and then we can pick up again next week. So please, if you do have anything out there that you'd like us to talk about, do drop us a line on any of the bits of contact info you can see at the bottom of the screen. And if that's it for now, I'd like to thank Prasanna and Aidan for joining. Yeah, just give us a shout. We can talk about whatever you like. Thanks everyone for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for catching up with us later on, and we'll catch up with you next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.